If you're confused about fabric terms like grain, yarn, warp and weft, don't worry, you're in great company. I studied fashion at school, at university, at Central St. Martin's, and I worked in industry for over a decade, and I still get confused. I was writing another video on bias cutting, and I was trying to explain bias grains and how to cut on bias, and I was getting quite confused myself, so I decided to make this video. Hi, welcome to Pattern Making with Lee. In this video, we're going back to basics to understand how fabric is constructed. Yes, I will cover the definition of all the fabric terms like yarn, warp and weft and grain, but what this video really is about is understanding how fabric construction affects which grain you cut your patterns on. Because each direction on the fabric has different qualities that can help or hinder your garment. Let's start at the beginning. Woven fabrics are made up of hundreds of long yarns. Yarn is different from thread, which is what you buy at fabric stores to sew your sewing patterns. Yarns are thicker than threads, while threads are more durable and smoother, even though they're thinner. One yarn runs along the length of the fabric, so it's parallel to the fabric edge, known as the selvage. This is known as the warp yarn. The other yarn runs across the fabric, so the shorter edge. This is known as the weft yarn. If you look at the frayed edge here, you can see how they go over and under each other at a 90-degree angle, like a woven basket, to create the fabric. So there are two yarns running in perpendicular directions, but in sewing, instead of saying direction, we call it grain. The warp yarn running along the length of the fabric is called the lengthwise or straight grain, while the weft yarn running across the fabric is called the crosswise grain. There is a third direction we talk about, bias. Bias is any diagonal direction on the fabric, but when we say bias, we're usually referring to the true bias, which runs at a 45-degree angle, and there are two true biases on a piece of fabric. Because of the way the fabric is woven, each grain has different qualities. The lengthwise grain is the most stable and stronger grain. The crosswise grain is still strong, but it can give or stretch a bit. Why is the lengthwise grain stronger? Well, the warp yarn is often held tighter on the loom when weaving, and the weft yarn is sort of woven through it. The warp yarn can also be coated in sizing, which is a stiffening agent. Warp yarns are often twisted more, which binds the fibres more closely together, making a more compact yarn. Fabrics often have more warp yarns too, and because it's more densely packed, that grain becomes stronger. So that's the lengthwise and crosswise grain. But what about the bias? Well, it stretches a lot, especially the true bias. Why does this matter? Grain lines. Grain lines aren't on your fabric, they're on your pattern. The grain line is a straight line with two arrows on it that marks the direction of the lengthwise grain. The grain line can have arrows going in opposite directions, which means you can place the pattern either way, or the arrows are pointing in the same direction, which means the pattern can only be placed going one direction. If your fabric has a print or nap, which is a raised surface, like velvet, it's really important your arrows are going in the same direction. Otherwise, the print or pile, if it's velvet, might be going in different ways on your pattern, and it will look really weird. When you cut your sewing patterns, the grain line must run parallel to the selvage because it's indicating the lengthwise grain. So how do you cut on the bias or crosswise grain? As I mentioned, grains have different qualities, and pattern makers can harness those qualities by retaining the grain line so the pattern is cut on a different grain. The lengthwise grain running parallel to the selvage has the least amount of stretch, so most patterns are cut in this direction. Because we don't really want the fabric to stretch along the length or for the hem to drop, we want it to be stable. Another benefit, when the front and back patterns are cut with the lengthwise grain running down them, the crosswise grain, which has a bit of stretch, will be running across our body. The fabric will stretch and mold around the body a bit. Most of the patterns, I'd say 80% of patterns are cut with the lengthwise grain going down them, but sometimes you want the pattern to be stronger across the body. And you'll see this on shirt patterns. See how the back yoke, collar and cuff have the grain line running in opposite directions? Back yoke and cuffs are the most common examples of these. And if you have trouble remembering that, think of a striped shirt. See how the stripes go different directions on the back yoke and on the cuff? They're cut on the crosswise grain. Before I discuss cutting on the bias, I want to do a quick recap. When you cut any pattern, all of the grains and their qualities are present. If you look at the front here, the lengthwise grain runs down it, so the length is the most stable. The crosswise grain, which stretches a bit, runs across it, and the bias grain is still there. Any seam on the diagonal or a curved armhole is partly on the bias. Which is why sewing instructions will tell you to stay stitch armholes and necklines so that it stretch, and if you're making a pattern, you need to shorten seams and style lines that are on the diagonal. So when the grain line is drawn, the pattern maker is really thinking, hey, what grain quality do I want running along the length of my pattern and across it? And sometimes they want the pattern to be able to stretch and move with the body. So they rotate the grain line to cut on the bias. Remember, the grain line indicates the lengthwise grain, so this is where the crosswise grain will be, in blue, and the two true biases are in red. Cutting on the bias is very common for evening wear, and bias cut clothing feels amazing to wear because the bias grain, which has that natural stretch, is running across the body, so it shapes around you and moves and it doesn't constrict you, so it feels beautiful to wear and also drapes really beautifully as well. And when you cut the pattern, you line the grain line up so it's parallel to the selvage, just like before. I hope this has given you a better understanding, a bit more respect for the grain line. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to cut it parallel to the selvage. If you don't, the pattern will be slightly on the bias, which means the fabric will stretch, the hem will drop, and be uneven. The fabric also twists, so it's really important your grain line is parallel to the selvage. I am going to do a video on how to cut fabrics properly with tips on how to get your grain line parallel. So subscribe to my channel and click on the notifications bell so you don't miss any videos. I'm also got a series on bias dresses coming up, which I'm very excited about.